Under the blistering lights of a live Senate showdown, Jasmine Crockett, the fierce voice of America's forgotten, squares off against Mitch McConnell, the 40-year titan of conservative power. As 27 million uninsured Americans watch in silence, one bill threatens to flip the soul of the nation. Is health care a right or a luxury for the privileged? McConnell defends private insurance as the cornerstone of choice, but just minutes in, Jasmine strikes back with undeniable evidence exposing deep-rooted inequality and corporate influence. The chamber gasps. The balance shatters. When truth finally speaks for 27 million uninsured, who gets saved and who stays forgotten? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Jasmine Crockett, a young congresswoman from Texas, was determined to reform the healthcare system to protect low-income families and minorities. After winning a special election with a campaign focused on healthcare equity, she became a rising star in the Democratic Party. "We cannot ignore the injustice in our healthcare system," she proclaimed, representing the voices of those left behind by a broken system. Opposing her was Mitch McConnell, the seasoned Republican leader, known for defending free market policies and blocking reforms like Medicare for All. "The free market, not the government, is the answer to health care," he argued, aligning with powerful insurance companies and private healthcare interests. The stage was set for a heated Senate debate where McConnell and Crockett, with their starkly opposing views, would clash over the future of American healthcare. This wasn't just a policy discussion, it was a pivotal battle for the nation's future. But just as Jasmine's passion lit up the chamber, McConnell struck with a different kind of force. Not fire, but ice, offering not empathy, but control, wrapped in the language of choice and freedom. His tone was steady, almost quiet, but it carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades defending the system. "This debate," he began, "is not just about healthcare. It's about freedom. Freedom to choose your doctor. Freedom to decide how you're treated. Freedom to control your future, not handed over to a government official with a checklist." He pointed to the private insurance system as a success, not a failure. "Companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield and United Healthcare," he said, "serve millions of Americans, not because they're forced to, but because they offer choice, and they keep improving. They invest in technology, they reduce wait times, they give people plans that actually fit their lives." Then his voice hardened. "You want government-run care?" he asked, looking straight at Jasmine. "Go look at the United Kingdom. The NHS, their public system, has over 4.7 million people waiting for treatment. Waiting, not getting care. That's what happens when government takes control. You don't get health care, you get a place in line." The chamber grew quiet. McConnell's argument wasn't emotional, it was strategic. He framed Jasmine's proposal as dangerous, even naive. "This system may not be perfect," he said, "but it works. People get to choose, they're not trapped. What Jasmine is proposing takes that choice away." He ended with one final jab. "Big government never gives freedom. It only takes it away, one promise at a time." And just when it seemed McConnell had finished his strike, he reloaded with cold precision, not merely defending the system's freedom, but now presenting its corporate machinery as the very engine of human progress. His voice didn't rise, it cut. Steady, pointed, deliberate. "What makes American healthcare strong isn't control," he began. "It's competition." He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands like a man confident in the weight of numbers, not sentiment. "Private insurers aren't just delivering care. They're innovating. They're in a race to be faster, smarter, better. And in that race, the American people are the winners." He cited findings from the Health Policy Research Institute, listing advancements: AI-based diagnostics, 24/7 telemedicine, dynamic coverage plans tailored by region and age group. All, he said, made possible not by government planning, but by market pressure. Blue Cross, Aetna, United. They're not waiting on Washington to act. They're building the future because competition forces them to, he said, his gaze locked, unblinking. And when companies are forced to compete for your business, they listen, they change, they evolve. Then came the pivot, precise and brutal. Now imagine replacing all that with a government plan, he continued. One set of rules, one provider, no pressure to improve, no consequences for delay, and no options when they get it wrong. He paused, letting silence draw tension like a wire pulled taut. That's not just inefficient, he said. That's dangerous. His tone never cracked, because for McConnell, this wasn't a matter of empathy. It was a war of systems. And in that war, he was betting everything on the cold engine of the free market. Not because it was compassionate, but because it was relentless. But before McConnell could crown the free market as the savior of American health, Jasmine rose. Not with a retort, but with a reckoning. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice didn't tremble. It carried the weight of thousands who had been silenced by a system that priced their lives by the decimal. Let me be absolutely clear, she began, her tone low but rising like a storm behind glass. Healthcare is not a commodity to be bargained for. It is a basic human right. She didn't pace. She planted herself like a pillar. You do not ask someone if they can afford to live, she said, gaze locked on McConnell. You do not make survival a business transaction. Her hand slid across the podium, revealing a battered pocket constitution. Life, liberty, equal protection under the law, she quoted, voice sharpening. How can you promise Americans the right to life and then tell them access to the care that keeps them alive is optional? She leaned forward now, her voice pressing into the bones of the room. We don't have a healthcare system. We have a profit machine that feeds on the sick and punishes the poor. And we dare to call that freedom? Her words were not loud, but they were seismic. Freedom, she continued, is not the right to choose between overpriced plans. Freedom is not telling a mother her child's fever must wait until payday. Freedom is not a waiting room filled with silence, because people are too afraid to ask what treatment costs. The chamber fell deathly still. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't debating policy. She was putting the soul of the system on trial, and her indictment was brutal. If healthcare isn't a right, then justice in America is a lie. And as her words scorched the silence, Jasmine didn't step down. She stepped deeper, from policy to pain, from statistics to the soul of the crisis. There's a name I need this chamber to remember, she said slowly, her voice quieter now. Not from fear, but reverence. Marissa Johnson, 37 years old, single mother, lives in Southeast Dallas. The lights above flickered slightly as she pulled a photograph from a folder. A woman smiling beside a little girl, their faces full of joy that the system would later crush. This is Marissa and her daughter Ava. I met them during a community health drive last spring. They came in for a basic screening. What we didn't expect was a lump. Jasmine's voice didn't shake, but her fingers curled slightly as she held the photo. Breast cancer, stage 2. It was early, treatable, but not affordable. The room shifted in its seat. Lawmakers glanced at one another, some uncomfortable, some hardened by years of hearings. Jasmine didn't let them look away. Marissa works 2 jobs, not by choice, but by survival. She cleans corporate offices at night, maybe even some of yours. In the mornings, she waits tables at a diner. No benefits, no union, just tips, bleach burns on her hands, and hope that nothing goes wrong. She paused just long enough for the air to feel heavier. But something did go wrong. And when it did, Marissa learned what it means to be uninsured in America. Jasmine's voice grew sharper now, not yelling, but with the coiled intensity of someone who has had to sit with too many stories like this. Her oncologist gave her the numbers. $14,000 for the first round of chemo. Radiation, another $18,000. Surgery? Don't even ask. She dropped her gaze to the floor for a moment before continuing. So she made a choice, not a choice born from freedom, but from fear. She told me, and I quote, I would rather die quietly than have Ava watch me fall apart under a mountain of debt I can't pay from a hospital bed. Jasmine stepped back, her breath catching just slightly before continuing. So what did she do? She walked out of the clinic, out of care, out of her own fight for life. She put on her uniform, tied her apron, and went back to work. The chamber was dead silent now. No shuffling papers, No whispered remarks, just stillness, the kind that only truth could command. Then came the data, but not cold or abstract. It came like a verdict. Jasmine held up a bound copy of a recent study. The American College of Physicians found that 27 million Americans are currently uninsured. That's nearly 1 in 10. 1 in 10 in the most medically advanced country in the world. And guess who they are? Not CEOs, not senators. They're warehouse workers, janitors, cashiers, home health aides. The people who kept this country moving while the rest of us worked from behind screens. She turned toward McConnell directly now. And let's be honest, we all know which communities are hit the hardest. Black, brown, immigrant, low income, rural. People who already start 5 steps behind and then are told to run a marathon against a system that never wanted them to finish. She lifted the photo of Marissa again, this time facing it toward the C-SPAN cameras. This woman is not a statistic. She is a mother, a worker, an American, and in any civilized nation, she would already be in treatment. But here, in the land of free market medicine, she has to choose between dying or drowning in debt. Jasmine walked slowly toward the center of the chamber, her heels echoing on the marble floor like a metronome counting down the seconds Marissa didn't have. I am sick of hearing that people like her just need to work harder. Marissa is working herself into the grave. I am sick of hearing that competition will drive prices down. You don't haggle with cancer, Mr. McConnell. You don't shop around for stage 2. Her voice grew firmer with every line. I'm told that government care is inefficient. But what do you call a system where the only treatment a mother can afford is prayer? Where survival depends not on diagnosis, but on your zip code, your income, or whether your employer offers a plan? She turned once more to the Senate floor. A room filled with polished suits, sponsored agendas, and long-held power. You can talk to me about freedom, she said, eyes blazing. But if freedom means standing by while women like Marissa are sentenced to death by invoice, then your definition of freedom is broken, and I refuse to accept it. She returned to her seat slowly, the photo of Marissa still in her hand, never folding it away. Because this moment wasn't a debate, it was a requiem for every life made disposable by a system that dares to call itself civilized, and every silence that allowed it to stay that way. And as the last echo of Marissa's story dissolved into silence, Jasmine did not pause. She did not soften, because what she was about to reveal wasn't just a flaw, it was the foundation. This isn't about one mother in Texas, she began, her voice now lower, deliberate, not for lack of passion, but for the gravity of what came next. It's about a design, a structure, a system that rewards wealth, punishes poverty, and leaves millions of people who look like me, who grew up like me, to suffer in silence. She raised a thick, spiral-bound report and held it like a prosecutor presenting the key piece of evidence. This is not opinion. It's not anecdote. It's the CDC's own findings, and they should chill every single one of us to the bone. She flipped the first page with a snap. If you're poor in America, you're more likely to get sick and less likely to be treated. That's not hyperbole, that's math. Her eyes scanned the room. Senators in expensive suits, some staring down, some frozen in discomfort. You're more likely to develop diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, heart disease, and you're more likely to die from them. Why? Because the system is built to serve those who can pay and ignore the rest. She walked slowly along the chamber floor, her words cutting through the air like a scalpel. The average uninsured person delays care until it's too late. And if you're Black, if you're Latino, if you live in a poor zip code, that delay is longer. The outcomes are worse. And the suffering? It's invisible in rooms like this. Her voice sharpened. This isn't negligence. This is discrimination, made legal through policy and invisible through indifference. She pointed directly to the printed line in the report. Black Americans are 40% more likely to suffer from hypertension, 60% more likely to die from stroke. Latino children? Less likely to receive basic checkups. Native populations? Hospitals hundreds of miles away, if they even exist. She slammed the report on the desk. So no, this system does not treat everyone equally. It protects the privileged and leaves the rest to bleed out slowly. She leaned forward now, her eyes locked on the front bench. You think someone working 2 jobs has the time or money for preventive care? You think a family on food stamps can afford a specialist for their child's seizures? You think a woman in rural Mississippi, whose nearest OB/GYN clinic just closed, has choices? Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but rage. This is not a healthcare system. It's a caste system, and we built it. She let that line settle like a stone dropped in water. Then she continued, quieter, but no less forceful. And you know what's worse than the inequality, she said? It's that we normalize it. We teach people to accept it. We shame them for not having insurance, for showing up to the ER too late, for dying in debt. She turned to the gallery, her voice echoing. We bury them twice, once in the ground and once beneath the myth that it was their fault. Her closing words were not shouted. They were etched into the air like a final oath. Healthcare in America is not about wellness, it's about worth. And if you're poor, if you're black, if you're rural, this system will measure your value in dollars and leave you behind when the math doesn't add up. She stepped back, her face a mirror of controlled fury and unbearable truth. This isn't freedom. This is injustice. Financed, legalized, and televised. And still, no one in that chamber moved. Because Jasmine hadn't just spoken, she had exposed. And as Jasmine's words carved through the chamber, like truth wrapped in thunder, Mitch McConnell did not flinch. He simply adjusted his glasses, lifted a government report like a shield, and spoke with the calm of a man who'd spent decades mastering the art of stone-faced resistance. While the Congresswoman pleads with emotion, he began, voice low but resonant, this body has a duty, not just to feel, but to calculate. He tapped the thick Congressional Budget Office document before him, its blue seal gleaming under the chamber lights. Because for every noble intention, there is a cold cost. And this, he said, holding the report higher, is the price of unchecked idealism. He flipped to the bookmarked page as if it were a final exhibit in a courtroom trial. Expanding federal health care coverage as proposed would increase public spending by $860 billion over the next 10 years. That's not conjecture. That's not political spin. That's the CBO's own projection. His gaze scanned the room, not with fire, but with frost. You want to talk about justice? He continued. Tell that to the American worker whose taxes will skyrocket to cover this. Tell it to the small business owner who's already drowning in payroll obligations. Tell it to the veteran who'll lose housing benefits because funds were redirected to prop up an inefficient government healthcare model. He took one step forward, anchoring the moment. Every dollar this Congress pours into sweeping healthcare expansions comes out of something else. Public schools, clean water, national security. Dreams don't pay bills, and compassion, untethered from fiscal discipline, collapses into chaos. There was no shouting in his voice, only the cold mechanics of strategy. We've seen what happens when governments overreach. Look to nations where waiting lists stretch into years, where care is rationed, where medical staff flee under the weight of bureaucracy. He nodded toward the silent CSPAN cameras. That's not compassion. That's collapse dressed as care. He paused, letting the chamber sit in silence. Not the reverent kind Jasmine commanded, but the tense stillness of political chess. Then softer, with a faint edge of warning, let me be clear. We are not choosing between care and cruelty. We are choosing between reality and ruin. And I, for one, will not vote to mortgage the soul of this nation on the back of promises we can't afford to keep. And with that, McConnell stepped back, not as a man shaken, but as one who believed that the cold arithmetic of the ledger sheet would, in the end, outlast the fire of the microphone. And as the murmurs from his last argument began to fade, McConnell's tone darkened, not louder but colder, like a final card drawn in a rigged game. He wasn't just attacking Jasmine's proposal now. He was going after the very programs she defended as lifelines. Let's not pretend, McConnell began, the weight of 3 decades in the Senate sharpening every syllable. Medicaid was supposed to be the safety net, the solution. the moral insurance policy for the most vulnerable in America. And yet, he held up a set of state-by-state graphs, red circles tightening around key failure points. After decades and hundreds of billions of dollars, what do we really have to show for it? He didn't wait for an answer. In states that have embraced Medicaid expansion, especially those governed by my colleagues across the aisle, we still see millions of working-class Americans without reliable care. In New York, in Illinois, in California, the numbers are flatlining, not because the people don't want help, but because the help is a bureaucratic labyrinth. Delays, denials, clinics without doctors, hospitals closing in rural zip codes while budgets balloon in the capital. His voice cut through the chamber like a verdict. What was promised as a lifeline has become a dead end. He stepped forward, eyes locked on Jasmine, as if daring her to refute it. This isn't generosity, it's government dressed as mercy, failing in plain sight. Medicaid doesn't reduce poverty. It manages it. It institutionalizes it. And worst of all, it keeps families in a cycle of dependency, where healthcare is just enough to survive, but never enough to rise. His hand struck the podium like a gavel. That's not progress. That's entrapment. Then quieter, more ominous. And now you want to scale this model up? To nationalize the inefficiency? To universalize the dysfunction? A pause. I say no. I say we don't build the future on the bones of systems already collapsing. And for a moment, the silence that followed wasn't just political. It was moral. Tense. As if the weight of two Americas, one buried in forms and wait lists, the other defended by spreadsheets, had just been laid bare before the world. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. As McConnell's cold logic tried to cast public programs as failures and compassion as fiscal recklessness, she stepped forward with something far more dangerous than data, conviction sharpened by truth. Let me ask this chamber, she began, voice steady but rising. When did we decide that justice must always come with a receipt? That dignity belongs only to those who can afford it? Her words echoed through the chamber with an urgency that felt less like a speech and more like a siren. Healthcare isn't a privilege. It isn't a product. It isn't something you win if your employer plays nice or your premiums don't double. It is a right, a human right, and we have let that truth rot beneath paperwork, premiums, and political cowardice. She held up a printed map of the United States, the colors darkening in the areas with the highest medical bankruptcy rates. This isn't some foreign theory, she continued. This is America today, where a single emergency room visit can cost more than a year's rent, and a cancer diagnosis can turn a working-class family into the homeless. Her eyes narrowed, targeting the myth McConnell had carefully built. You talk about freedom, Senator, but what freedom does a mother have when she has to choose between chemo and childcare? What freedom does a father have when his insulin costs more than his mortgage? She moved closer to the podium, lowering her voice like a blade sliding into its sheath, controlled, precise. The truth is, this so-called free market isn't free at all. It's a trap, a system designed not to serve, but to sift, to sort the worthy from the expendable, the insured from the invisible. She held up her next weapon, a color-coded chart comparing healthcare spending and outcomes across nations. And while we bankrupt our people in the name of choice, countries like Norway, Sweden, and Finland have proven that universal care is not only possible, it's sustainable, equitable, and profoundly effective. Her hand trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the pressure of every name she carried. In Sweden, administrative costs for healthcare are less than 3%. Here, over 25% funneled into billing departments, profit margins, and C-suite bonuses. In Finland, every citizen has access to comprehensive coverage, and they still spend thousands less per capita than we do. And in Norway, wait times are publicly tracked, reviewed, and reduced, not hidden in red tape or passed down to desperate families on hold for weeks. She looked up, eyes locking with McConnell's, defiant. You say public health care is too expensive. I say your version is too cruel. Then she paused long enough for silence to creep back in, long enough to remind everyone watching that this wasn't a performance. It was a confrontation. Do you want to talk about cost? She asked, her tone shifting. Heavier now. Let's talk about the 500,000 Americans who file for medical bankruptcy every year. Let's talk about the billions we waste on administrative bloat, on billing disputes, on duplicative insurance overhead. She jabbed at the air with each number, driving them in like nails. Let's talk about the price paid by a black woman in Mississippi who can't find a prenatal clinic within 60 miles. Or a child in rural Texas whose ear infection becomes meningitis because Medicaid expansion was blocked. Her breath caught for a beat, not from nerves but from memory. I've sat with mothers who buried their children because a $40 copay was the difference between early detection and too late. I've listened to veterans, men who wore this nation's uniform, tell me they were denied follow-ups, delayed surgery, denied dignity. And I've heard enough. She grabbed the final document in her pile, a thick-bound report stamped by the World Health Organization. This report, she said, voice rising again, concludes that universal public health care not only saves money long-term, it creates healthier, more productive societies. Not socialist wastelands, stronger nations, nations where your health isn't a tax bracket, but a birthright. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped back from the microphone and raised her hands, palms open. I don't expect you to agree with me, she said to the chamber. I expect you to look your constituents in the eye and explain why they're not worth what people in Norway are worth, or Denmark, or Canada. I expect you to tell a waitress with stage 2 breast cancer that she should have budgeted better. I expect you to look a father in the face after he loses his son to a treatable infection and explain that this system works just fine. Her words were not shouted, but they hit harder than any scream. They didn't bounce off the walls. They sank in. This debate isn't about ideology, she said, her voice quieter now but heavier than ever. It's about morality. And right now, we are failing that test. Every single day that we allow profit to dictate who lives and who dies, we fail. She let that hang. Not because she had more to say, but because there was nothing else anyone could say to diminish it. The room may have been filled with suits and speeches, but outside these walls, a different kind of trial had already begun. The people, tired of waiting, had rendered their verdict. Jasmine had their voices printed in ink. Jasmine stepped back from the podium momentarily, her fingers brushing the edge of a folder like a pianist preparing for the final, damning note. She turned, lifted a single document, and held it up for the entire chamber to see. This, she said slowly, isn't an opinion. It's a reckoning. The paper gleamed under the lights, an official summary from the Pew Research Center, stamped with the weight of public sentiment. 65% of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, say they want change. Not tomorrow, not in theory. Now they want a healthcare system that protects people, not profit margins. She walked slowly toward the center of the floor, her heels clicking like a countdown. And do you know what makes this more than just a number, she asked. It's not just because it's Pew, a gold standard research institution. It's because this result isn't isolated. It confirms what we've seen in wave after wave. Kaiser Family Foundation, Gallup, even internal data from the Department of Health. Americans are tired of being bankrupted by survival. The document trembled slightly in her hand, not from fear, but because she was holding something real. The voices of millions who never got to speak in rooms like this. This chamber has heard from lobbyists, from CEOs, from think tanks with fancy acronyms. Now it's time we listen to the people bleeding beneath their deductibles. Her tone deepened, calm but unrelenting. Because while this government hesitates, real people are forced to crowdsource chemotherapy. They're skipping medication to pay rent. They're rationing insulin while your donors buy yachts. A murmur rippled through the room, like a fire catching dry timber. She moved closer to the Republican bench. You want to call that emotional? Fine, it's emotional. So is dying alone in a hallway because your insurance was denied. So is watching your child deteriorate while a claims adjuster decides if you're worth it. She turned back toward the presiding chair, voice sharpened now like a courtroom cross-examiner. This data doesn't just reflect frustration. It reflects desperation, and it's bipartisan. McConnell leaned forward, his face unreadable, his fingers steepled. And then, With a voice cold enough to cut steel, he replied, "Polling is not policy," he said, as if stating gravity. "We are not here to chase emotional surges or political moods. We are here to govern, and I will not trade long-term fiscal responsibility for populist fantasy." The words landed like hammers, meant not to persuade, but to intimidate. "Let's not pretend," he added, "that surveys aren't shaped by carefully coordinated messaging, media pressure, and selective framing." He stood now, slow and deliberate. "We've seen it before. Manufactured momentum, polls driven by activist networks, sentiment inflated by fear campaigns. The Pew report is not scripture, it's statistics, and those statistics can be swayed." The chamber held its breath. McConnell wasn't done. "I do not deny the concerns of Americans," he said with a trace of performative empathy. "But policy cannot be built on noise. We must protect our fiscal foundations from being undermined by feel-good illusions." He turned toward Jasmine then, and the corners of his mouth curled. "I understand that Congresswoman Crockett believes in passion, but passion does not build hospitals. Passion does not pay for doctors. Passion does not balance the budget." The temperature in the room dropped, but Jasmine didn't blink. She stepped closer, her tone dropping to a lethal calm. "Passion doesn't pay for hospitals?" she repeated. "Neither does greed. And greed is the very reason we're in this mess. It's the reason Americans pay more per capita for health care than any other developed nation, and still die younger. That's not a policy flaw. That's a policy crime." She held the Pew report above her head. "This isn't noise," she snapped. "It's clarity. It's democracy. And if you think the voices of 2/3 of this country are just wind in the trees, then you've forgotten who you serve." She turned again to the gallery, as if speaking to the nation through the cameras. "The only thing more dangerous than ignoring data is pretending the public is too naive to know what's best for their lives. They don't want charity. They want justice. They don't want more choice. They want a system that doesn't punish them for getting sick." McConnell sat, unmoved, but his silence was louder than before. Jasmine walked slowly back to the center. "You say surveys are shaped by emotion. I say they're shaped by pain. And until you've been in a clinic that won't take your insurance or watched a parent sell their car to buy heart medication, you don't get to dismiss that pain as strategy." The document trembled again in her hand. But this time, it was the chamber that was shaking. But Jasmine had one card left, and it wasn't emotional, it was financial. If McConnell wanted to speak the language of power, she would show him exactly who was paying to keep his microphone on. Jasmine inhaled sharply, then stepped forward with a presence that seemed to swell across the chamber. "Let's drop the mask," she said coldly, pulling a bundle of highlighted finance records from her folder and slamming them on the desk. "You want to talk about responsibility? Then explain this. $3.8 million in direct contributions from the insurance industry to your campaigns over the last decade. United Health, Anthem, Cigna. Each line item isn't just a donation, it's a transaction, and the receipt is your voting record." The room fell into a stunned hush. She raised a hand, flipping through each page like a prosecutor unveiling a smoking gun. "You didn't block Medicare for all out of principle. You blocked it because the people who would lose billions if Americans had health care as a right, those people sign your checks." Her voice sharpened. "And while you sit here touting free market innovation, the real innovation is how these corporations turn democracy into a vending machine." She turned toward the gallery, her voice resonating beyond the chamber. "The people watching this at home, they're not imagining things. They feel it every time their premiums go up while executive bonuses soar. This isn't about disagreement, it's about betrayal. You're not representing Kentucky. You're representing C-suite boardrooms who've never waited 6 hours in an ER." Her eyes narrowed. "Let me be crystal clear. This system is sick, but the cancer isn't the poor. It's the profit motive you protect." But McConnell didn't waver beneath Jasmine's fire. He had weathered bigger storms, and now he would strike back with the polished conviction of a man who believed capitalism wasn't the problem, but the cure. McConnell's fingers curled around the edge of the podium as he rose with slow, deliberate confidence. His voice, gravelly with decades of Senate battle, cut through the murmurs like a blade through silk. "We don't preserve American excellence by punishing the very engines that power it," he began, eyes narrowing on Jasmine. "The healthcare industry doesn't innovate because it's told to. It innovates because it competes, because it must. That's where miracles are born." He raised a hand to a graph displayed behind him, one mapping the explosion of private investment into cancer immunotherapies, AI-assisted diagnostics, and precision medicine over the past decade. These advancements weren't birthed in government labs. They came from companies willing to risk billions for the chance to save lives. And yes, to make a profit. His voice hardened. Strip away the profit motive, and you strip away the drive to go further, faster, smarter. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like fog on the chamber floor. "You call it greed," he said, turning fully to Jasmine now. "But I call it survival, of innovation, of progress, of the very patients you're trying to protect. Without market freedom, we don't just lose choices, we lose futures." His tone dropped, low and firm. "And the alternative, a monolithic system where bureaucrats decide what drugs are worth funding, which hospitals get resources, and who lives long enough to see the next breakthrough. That's not care. That's control dressed as compassion." But Jasmine wasn't finished. Her tone sharpened, her pace slowed, not to ease the moment, but to make every word slice deeper. She wasn't arguing policy anymore. She was prosecuting a system. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward with a fire that didn't flicker. It roared. Her heels clicked against the cold Senate floor like the countdown of a ticking clock. In her hand was a black folder labeled NMHP:"Unfiltered." She paused just long enough to let the silence settle like smoke in a sealed room, then opened it. "The current system," she began, voice steady but blazing, "is not broken by accident. It is broken by design." She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words moved like artillery, precise, deliberate, lethal. "For every private hospital that thrives in Beverly Hills, there's a rural clinic in Mississippi that can't afford clean syringes. For every family with concierge doctors on speed dial, there are 10 others rationing insulin in a trailer park. And the only common thread, the only consistent pattern, is that those left behind are poor, black, brown, or invisible." Murmurs rippled across the room. Jasmine didn't stop. "This is the National Minority Health Programs report from just last quarter," she said, holding up a thick printed study. "It shows that in districts like mine, life expectancy drops up to 15 years compared to wealthier zip codes, 15 years, because of disparities in access to basic medical care." She flipped a page. "Black mothers die during childbirth at 3 times the rate of white mothers. Latinos with stage 2 cancer are diagnosed 11 months later on average. Native American communities wait 6 to 8 months just for specialist referrals." Her eyes locked onto McConnell like a missile. "And all this happens while billion-dollar insurance companies post record quarterly profits. You tell me this system serves the people?" McConnell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, eyes unreadable. Jasmine didn't flinch. "You call this the freest country in the world," she continued. "But what kind of freedom is this?" She turned her words toward the gallery, where members of the press were already typing feverishly. "The freedom to choose between chemotherapy and keeping your house? The freedom to die quietly because you couldn't afford an ambulance ride? That's not freedom. That's economic warfare, dressed up as healthcare policy." A beat passed. 1 second. 2. Then Jasmine raised a photo, a grainy image of a young woman clutching her stomach on a plastic chair in an emergency room hallway. Her name was Danica Brooks, 32 years old, single mother of 2. She had ovarian cancer, but no insurance. She was denied treatment 3 times because she was told she didn't meet the threshold for financial aid. Jasmine's voice cracked. Just slightly, just enough. She died on a Thursday morning, alone, because a system designed to maximize profit decided she wasn't worth the investment. Silence thundered in the chamber. And then finally, McConnell moved. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, then stood, his hands behind his back, the old warhorse of the Senate in full armor. His voice came low, firm, and unbending. "Congresswoman Crockett, I understand your passion, But I must respectfully disagree with your premise. He let the pause linger like the first drop of cold rain. You speak of injustice, of inequality, and I agree, there are real problems. But you mistake the disease for the cure. He turned slightly, now addressing the full room. The worst thing we could do is hand control of healthcare to Washington bureaucrats. That doesn't create equity. It creates dependency. He nodded toward the same gallery Jasmine had spoken to. The real question isn't who pays the bill, it's who chooses the doctor, who determines the treatment, who decides what lives are worth saving, and how much it should cost. He walked 2 steps forward, slow and deliberate. If you nationalize care, you don't eliminate injustice. You just relocate it. From corporate boards to government offices, from profit margins to wait lists. McConnell turned back to Jasmine, eyes flint sharp. Freedom is messy. It means some plans cost more than others. It means not everyone has the same outcomes. But it also means no one, not a politician, not a panel, gets to dictate your options. That's not oppression. That's liberty. Jasmine didn't blink, but her grip on the folder tightened. McConnell concluded with the calm of a man who'd rehearsed these words 1,000 times. A government powerful enough to guarantee your health care, he said, is powerful enough to control it. And history has shown us, over and over, that once you give that power away, you don't get it back. The room didn't cheer. It didn't jeer. It sat in silence, torn between two moral earthquakes that had just shaken the floor beneath them. And the real question remained, was freedom still freedom if only the rich could afford to survive it? As McConnell concluded his defense of market liberty with the same calculated ease he'd honed over decades, Jasmine Crockett didn't respond immediately. She stood in silence. The chamber stilled. Then, softly, purposefully, she walked toward the center table, a binder in her hand bearing the seal of the OECD. Senator, she began, you said America can't afford a public health care system, that it would bankrupt our nation. But the truth is, it's our current system that's bleeding us dry. She flipped open the binder, her tone sharpening. This is data, not from left-wing think tanks, not from campaign consultants, but from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. 38 member nations, capitalist nations, wealthy democracies, and here's what they all prove. We are the outlier. The screen behind her flickered to life, revealing a simple chart. Healthcare spending per capita, adjusted for purchasing power. The United States towered over every other bar. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, all spending less, all covering everyone, all achieving better health outcomes. Jasmine gestured toward the image, her voice rising with urgency. We pay more. We die younger. We go bankrupt faster. And for what? So insurance CEOs can pocket $20 million salaries while a working mother in Mississippi skips her insulin? She paused just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. The silence was thick. Her next line cut through it like a blade. You call that freedom, Senator? McConnell stirred, but said nothing. Jasmine took another step forward, her heels clicking like gavel strikes. Let's talk about Finland, a country that guarantees cancer treatment, dental care, maternal care, all free at point of service. And yet they spend 40% less per person than we do. That's not socialism. That's efficiency. That's morality backed by math. Her finger jabbed toward the next slide. Comparative infant mortality rates. The U.S. ranked below every other industrialized nation. And Sweden, she continued, almost breathless now. Universal prenatal care. No bills for childbirth. No 3-page itemized invoices for holding your newborn skin to skin. Just care. Just dignity. Just humanity. She locked eyes with McConnell. Meanwhile, in your home state of Kentucky, rural hospitals are closing. Black mothers are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth, and 41% of adults report delaying medical care due to cost. McConnell cleared his throat, shifting in his chair, but Jasmine was unrelenting. Let's strip away the politics. Let's talk about what this system does to real people. I have constituents who choose between chemotherapy and groceries, who show up to my town halls with bags of unpaid ER bills, who work 2 jobs and still get denied coverage because their deductible is more than their rent. She opened another document. OECD reports confirm it. Countries with public health care don't just save money, they build trust. Citizens seek care earlier, which means less hospitalization, fewer complications, longer lives. That's the ripple effect of compassion codified into law. Her tone dropped, lower, more intimate, almost a whisper through the microphone. And I want to ask you, Senator McConnell, if Finland can afford to treat its citizens with dignity, why can't we? A few members in the back shifted, some avoiding her gaze. Jasmine turned to the public gallery. This isn't academic. This is life and death. This is a father in Detroit who died of sepsis because he didn't have $200 for antibiotics. This is a waitress in Phoenix who broke her wrist and didn't go to the ER until it turned black. This is America in 2025, where your zip code and bank account decide whether you live or die. Then she returned to McConnell. I respect your experience. I respect your service. But I will not respect a defense of a system that profits from human suffering. You say the market fosters innovation. I say it rations mercy. You say government care is inefficient. I say a for-profit company denying a cancer patient treatment because they missed a premium by 3 days is the real inefficiency. McConnell leaned forward, trying to interrupt, but Jasmine held up a hand. I'm not finished. Her voice climbed again. We are the richest country on earth, and yet we are the only one where millions fear going to the hospital. The only one where a GoFundMe page is considered a form of insurance. That is not freedom. That is a systemic betrayal. She turned to the final page. A pie chart. Global administrative costs. America spends 4 times more on healthcare paperwork than any other nation because we've built a labyrinth of denials, delays, and fine print. We've let corporations write the rules, and what we get in return is a system that treats suffering as a sales opportunity. Finally, she closed the binder, the clap of its cover echoing off the marble walls. I am not asking for utopia. I am asking for basic decency. I am asking that we stop being the country where getting sick is a financial catastrophe. I am asking that we listen to the data, to the world, and to the people screaming from the margins. Then, soft but firm, she concluded, and I am asking you, Senator McConnell, to look those people in the eye and explain why they are unworthy of what Swedes and Finns and Germans already have. Because I refuse to. As Jasmine's voice faded and the gavel fell, the silence in the Senate chamber wasn't peace, it was pressure. Pressure that spread outward, leaking into headlines, hashtags, union halls, newsroom floors, and kitchen tables across America. The Senate floor was quiet, but the country was anything but. Within minutes of the debate's end, clips of Jasmine's dismantling of McConnell's arguments were everywhere, looped on news broadcasts, stitched into TikToks, and shared with fiery captions on Twitter. She spoke for us. Finally, someone stood up to power. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. Hashtags like Chushin Crockett clapback and Medicare is justice trended within the hour, surging with the kind of urgency that couldn't be faked. But for every voice cheering, another called it reckless. Right-wing commentators labeled her a radical, a socialist disguised in pearls. Fox News ran a segment titled, The Real Danger in Government Healthcare, Jasmine Crockett's Fantasy World. Yet even there, a few conservative-leaning independents admitted they were shaken, not by her politics, but by her facts. Because while McConnell quoted deficits, Jasmine named the dead. Inside the Capitol, reactions weren't just whispered, they were weaponized. Senators moved in tight huddles. Some eyed her warily, like she detonated a bomb in a room they thought was soundproof. Others, particularly newer progressive Democrats, walked over and gripped her shoulder with respect that couldn't be taught. Senator Chris Murphy reportedly leaned in and whispered, "You didn't argue policy. You gave people a reason to care." Outside, the reaction was even louder. The American Federation of Teachers released a statement within 2 hours. We stand with Representative Crockett. Healthcare injustice is education injustice. The SEIU followed suit, blasting an open letter signed by over 500 labor leaders. When our members have to choose between chemotherapy and groceries, the system has failed. Crockett is right to fight. But it wasn't just unions and progressives. Civil rights leaders mobilized. The NRLACP tweeted, "We've heard this speech before, but this time it wasn't from a preacher in a church. It was from a congresswoman in the halls of power." The pressure on McConnell intensified. In Louisville, a protest formed outside his district office, signs reading, "How many more need to die?" and "Mitch profits, we bleed." A group of nurses from Owensboro publicly canceled their long-standing Republican support, holding up their pay stubs and ER bills as silent protest. One wore a pin that simply read, "Crockett was right." Then came the numbers. Pew Research Center released a flash poll just 48 hours after the broadcast. 58% of Americans sided with Crockett's call for healthcare reform. More strikingly, 72% of people under 40 and 61% of independents expressed support for a public health option modeled on systems in Scandinavia. These weren't fringe left numbers. These were mainstream middle votes, shifting. McConnell's office tried to deflect. They issued a brief, icy statement. "Senator McConnell will continue defending American families from bloated government programs." But it rang hollow in a week where millions had seen their own family members reflected in Jasmine's words. Meanwhile, Jasmine refused to retreat. She returned to Texas and held a rally in Houston's 3rd Ward. Over 3,000 people came. Teachers, bus drivers, cancer survivors, immigrants, teenagers. There were no corporate sponsors, no confetti cannons. Just people. And when she took the stage, her voice cracked. Not from nerves, but from the weight of knowing her words had landed. "You showed me," she told them, "that truth travels faster than spin, that decency can trend, that if one voice is brave enough, a million more will answer." That voice wasn't just echoing in liberal cities. In Des Moines, a retired farmer named Gerald Haskins wrote an op-ed in his local paper. "I've voted Republican for 40 years, but I saw my daughter go bankrupt after an appendectomy. If what she said is socialism, maybe socialism's overdue." Back on Capitol Hill, shifts were subtle but seismic. A moderate Democrat from Ohio, who'd previously stayed silent on Medicare for All, announced he'd co-sponsor Jasmine's upcoming bill on public health care expansion. A Republican staffer was overheard saying, "McConnell underestimated her, and now we've got a movement on our hands." But the backlash wasn't over. Political attack ads started rolling in. One super PAC aired a commercial showing empty hospitals and doomsday music, warning, "If Jasmine Crockett wins, government will own your doctor." The ad failed miserably. It was mocked mercilessly on TikTok, dubbed over with clown music, and ended up boosting Jasmine's fundraising by $600,000 in a single weekend. And behind the scenes, Jasmine's office phone didn't stop ringing. Veterans with stories of denied care. Mothers with boxes of unpaid medical bills. A school nurse from Arkansas wrote, "I played your speech over the intercom." Kids cried. So did I. For every senator who smirked behind closed doors, there were 10,000 Americans who said, "She's telling the truth no one else dares to say out loud." By the end of the week, editorials flooded in. The New York Times, "A spark in the Senate." The Atlantic, "The most important speech on health care in a decade." Even the Wall Street Journal, normally conservative, admitted Jasmine Crockett may have shifted the national conversation. And yet, through all the praise, all the noise, Jasmine remained focused. She wasn't seeking headlines. She was seeking action. Her staff received over 90,000 emails from constituents begging Congress to pass reform. Her office began coordinating with state leaders, unions, and community clinics to craft a coalition larger than politics, something approaching moral momentum. But behind closed doors, McConnell was livid. Aides reported he viewed Jasmine's rise as a threat to institutional order. And perhaps it was, because the system had always counted on silence, from the sick, the poor, the overworked. Jasmine Crockett had shattered that silence with one voice, and now the chamber would never sound the same again. But as the roar of the chamber faded into murmurs and the cameras powered down, something more enduring than applause remained, something Jasmine had ignited that couldn't be silenced by votes or vetoes. It began not with a law, but with a tremor, one that rumbled beneath the polished floors of Capitol Hill and rolled outward into homes, hospitals, barbershops, and back alleys across the country. The debate between Jasmine Crockett and Mitch McConnell wasn't just another partisan clash. It was a rupture in the silence that had smothered millions of forgotten lives. Overnight, Clips of her fiery rebuttals flooded the internet, played on loop on cable news, and echoed from pulpits and street corners. Protesters gathered in front of insurance headquarters, holding up signs with faces of those who had died waiting for care. This is what delay looks like. One sign read beneath a photo of a 5-year-old girl who passed from untreated asthma. In Congress, the ripple became a wave. Freshman lawmakers, many previously silent, cited Jasmine's performance as a turning point. A group of bipartisan representatives, mostly under 45, introduced the Health Equity Accountability Act, borrowing language directly from Crockett's closing arguments. Though symbolic at first, the gesture forced televised hearings on corporate lobbying in healthcare, exposing millions in hidden donations. Even senior figures who had previously toed the line, senators from swing states, cautious and calculating, began to ask, what if she's right? What if we've sold the soul of our healthcare system for campaign checks? But the pushback was swift and merciless. Lobbying groups launched counter-campaigns smearing Jasmine as radical, uninformed, even un-American. Super PAC ads ran nightly, twisting her quotes into fear-mongering slogans. One clip cut her words to falsely imply she supported abolishing private health care entirely. Behind closed doors, McConnell met with insurance executives and promised, "This storm will pass. We've weathered louder voices before." He wasn't wrong, but this time the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Across the country, town halls turned into battlegrounds. Elderly veterans stood up, demanding answers for denied VA claims. Mothers held up expired insulin vials. One nurse broke down mid-question, sobbing as she described watching a teenager die of sepsis in a rural ER with no doctors on duty. "How many more stories do you need?" she screamed at a senator frozen behind the podium. These weren't isolated moments. They were symptoms of a sickness long ignored, and Jasmine's voice had become the diagnosis. Universities hosted public forums on healthcare justice. Law schools dissected the constitutional arguments she'd made about the right to life and equitable protection. Medical students wore T-shirts with her quote, "Health isn't a privilege, it's a promise." Even late-night comedians, who usually danced around policy, replayed her exchanges with McConnell, ending with punchlines that turned into standing ovations. Something raw and righteous had been unleashed, and it wasn't going back into a press release. And yet, inside the marble columns of the Capitol, change moved like molasses. The Senate stalled reform bills in committee. Key amendments were stripped. A watered-down version of the accountability bill passed the House, only to die in the Senate 51-49. Jasmine watched from the floor as her colleagues negotiated away pieces of what she called the people's dignity in backroom deals. Still, she stood. Still, she spoke. Still, she fought. On the anniversary of the debate, she returned to that same chamber, no longer just the firebrand from Texas, but the symbol of a movement. She read aloud new names, those lost in the years since to preventable conditions, bureaucratic delays, unaffordable prescriptions. The gallery was packed, not with donors or dignitaries, but families, survivors, nurses, people in wheelchairs. When she finished, no one clapped. They rose, silent, united. Jasmine turned to the camera. Her voice, steady and sharp, cut through the silence. "This debate may have started with policy, but it ends with people. If the system can't be moved by their pain, then maybe it should be replaced by their power." And with that, the conversation around healthcare in America was no longer confined to budget lines and partisan soundbites. It became a moral reckoning, a call that reached the soul of a nation. Mitch McConnell may have had the votes, but Jasmine Crockett had something more dangerous. She had the momentum of millions. And that in Washington is how history begins. And yet amid the policy shifts, the polling surges, and the thunder of crowds chanting Jasmine's name, a quieter question lingered, one that no headline could answer. What had this battle truly cost? And what deeper truth had it revealed about who we are as a nation? There's a certain stillness that comes after a storm. Not peace, but reckoning. As Jasmine Crockett stood alone in her dimly lit office days after the Senate hearing, a copy of the Constitution in one hand and a stack of constituent letters in the other, she wasn't celebrating. The cameras were off. The crowds were gone. All that remained were the names. Names of people who had written to her after the debate. A single mother in Arkansas whose child died from untreated diabetes. A retired coal miner in West Virginia denied lung treatment due to a technicality. A teenage girl who had to crowdfund her mother's chemotherapy. "You said what I couldn't," one letter read. "Thank you for making us visible." Jasmine didn't smile. She wept, not from sadness, but from the unbearable weight of being a mirror for a nation's pain. What she had learned, what America had been forced to confront, is that injustice doesn't always wear a badge or carry a gun. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence, of inaction, of shrugging shoulders in marble halls while children die from preventable infections. The lesson wasn't just about healthcare, it was about humanity. It was about the lie we tell ourselves when we say the market will fix what the heart has broken. Jasmine's battle showed that access to care is not a question of policy. It's a measure of moral clarity. Who do we consider worthy of saving? Who do we leave behind because saving them doesn't yield profit? Her voice had shaken the Senate, but it had done something greater. It cracked the veneer of political civility and forced the nation to look in the mirror. The most harrowing truth she uncovered was not that the system is broken, it's that it was built to be this way. Jasmine had faced down Mitch McConnell, not just as a senator, but as a symbol of decades of calculated resistance to reform. He wasn't just defending policy, he was defending an ecosystem of privilege, where suffering is tolerated so long as it stays out of sight. That moment taught America a brutal lesson, that those who benefit from inequality will always call justice radical. They will smear reform as chaos and frame empathy as weakness. But Jasmine didn't break under the weight of their mockery. She stood taller. "Justice," she had shouted into the chamber, "isn't disruptive. Injustice is." That sentence would be printed in textbooks, quoted in courtrooms, and whispered by parents to their children during hospital vigils. The human lesson extended beyond politics. It was about storytelling. Who gets to tell it and who gets erased? Jasmine gave voice to those who had been rendered invisible, not because they were few, but because they were inconvenient. People who work 2 jobs and still can't afford insulin. Veterans who fought for the flag but can't afford dental care. Mothers who choose between groceries and an inhaler. By dragging these stories into the national spotlight, Jasmine rewrote the rules of engagement. No longer could lawmakers hide behind abstract numbers. The human toll was laid bare. For every talking point McConnell deployed, Jasmine countered with a name, a face, a story. And suddenly policy had a pulse. And what of hope? That was the final and most fragile lesson. Hope is not handed down from podiums or drafted into legislation. It is wrestled from silence by those brave enough to speak. Jasmine had hoped, yes, but she also dared. Dared to name the rot. Dared to risk her career. Dared to become the vessel for a country's collective ache. Her fight taught America that courage doesn't come from always knowing the outcome. It comes from acting anyway, from standing in the fire when it would be easier to disappear. "If I lose my seat for this," she once told a reporter, "at least I'll lose it fighting for people who never had one at the table." What lingered after the hearing, what echoed in the halls of Congress and in kitchen tables across the country, was not a policy victory. It was a soul-deep reminder that systems are built by people, and people can unbuild them too. Jasmine's crusade revealed that we're not powerless. We're just told we are. That belief, perhaps more than any vote or law, is what keeps injustice alive. But now millions no longer believed it, not after Jasmine. She had cracked the illusion, and so the nation entered a new chapter. Not fixed, not perfect, but awake. Lawmakers started drafting bold legislation with language that once would have been considered electoral suicide. Teachers added Jasmine's testimony to civics curriculums. Hospitals in blue and red states alike began piloting nonprofit care programs. The winds hadn't shifted overnight, but they had shifted, and every breeze carried Jasmine's voice like a lighthouse in the storm. That was her legacy, not just the sound and fury of a Senate showdown, but the human lesson carved into the conscience of a country. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.